Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the channel. Thank you so much for clicking on this video. So you've made it. So welcome to part E of the Caro-Kann Defense. This is the fifth and final part of our masterclass mini-series on my personal favorite opening for black when white plays 1e4. So this last part is going to cover some different sidelines and some other things that white can play. Sometimes when I'm working with my students, I teach them a new opening. They'll say, that's great, but I'll go play, and they never play that, right? They play some off-the-wall stuff where they're out of book on move 3 or 4. So this video will address some of those beginner, maybe amateur types of lines. There will be some legitimate things we'll talk about, like the two knights attack, the Hillbilly Attack, what happens if white plays the King's Indian Attack, and some different random things that they can throw at us. And so hopefully you guys will get something out of this. So let's go ahead and get started.
And here we go.
Here we go, guys. So you'll notice I have kind of a humorous picture up there in the top right-hand corner to notate some of the wild, wacky, crazy things that white can throw at us in these beginner lines and some of these other sidelines that we'll take a look at in this last section. So obviously we won't cover everything, but we'll get to as many as we can. So we're going to start off with the two knights attack for white, which is a very legitimate line. It just didn't have any other place to put it in the mini series. So we'll start off with this. Two knights attack is exactly what it sounds like. We'll start with our normal Caro-Kann, and they will get one of their two knights out first. It doesn't matter, either knight c3 or knight f3. We're going to continue, and they get the second knight out. So when you see white develop both of these, this is the two knights attack. We are going to capture this. They're going to take back. Now, earlier in the classical variation, we said black can play bishop to f5 or knight to f6, and those are the same. Here, that's not the case. So in the two knights attack, you do need to play knight f6. This is definitely the best move. So from here, white can do a couple of different things. And one of the odd things that you may see is queen to e2. And this is kind of an interesting line. So from this point, you know, obviously they can capture our knight on f6. And here we have a nice developing move. We can just play knight to d7 to support this knight.
Psych!
Game over.
Yep, just kidding. Please, please, please don't do that. That will hurt. So in this position, the best move is actually just to take that knight. They're going to take back with the queen, and now we can transfer this knight back over to where the original knight was on f6. They're going to bring their bishop out to c4. We'll play knight to f6, attacking the queen. And sometimes here, guys, white will actually blunder, and they will play knight to e5, and they simply hang their queen. So we're definitely going to take that here. And the next sound that we hear is so kidding again. So yes, this queen e2, and let's go back. Okay, so in the two knights attack, when you see queen to e2, buckle up, because white has some tricks up their sleeve. Don't ever play knight b to d7, and when they bring out their bishop and their knight and they offer up their queen freely, just remember,
don't ever
take that free queen. So what do we do instead? We simply play e6, and now we have blocked off any kind of checkmating threats. The correct move for white is to bring their queen back to e2. Now you could come over here and put some pressure on the knight. That's okay, but the best move, we really need to get in the move b5. And the reason for that is we need to free up our light-scored bishop on c8. Now, the best move for white is to drop their bishop back, but sometimes you will see white actually take this pawn on c6, and just know if they grab that, this is losing by force for white, okay? So this is, you do kind of have to remember the moves here, but just know that white is completely lost. So we're going to play queen to c7, immediately putting pressure on the knight. They're going to take the pawn on b5. We're going to push a6 to hit that bishop. They're going to drop the bishop back. We're going to play bishop to d7. Now we've got two attackers on this knight. They only have one defender. So the only hope for white is to play one of the following queen moves. They can either play queen to f3, trying to support this, or they can try queen to c4 to support the knight, but it doesn't work. We simply play rook to c8. And boys and girls, that is all she wrote. There is no way to defend this knight. We have 1, 2, 3 attackers. They cannot add a third defender. So this knight is lost, and this is completely winning for black. And so here the engine says this is minus 2.5 for black, and that's what happens when you get greedy hunting down pawns in the opening of a chess game. Back to this spot where we said white could try to bring their queen to c4 to add more protection to the knight on c6. Here we have a little bit different set of moves. We're going to play knight to d5 first. And the point of that is to go to b6 to fork the queen and the bishop. White has a couple of pawn moves they can try. They can try, say they push the d pawn. Well, we're going to hit them with the fork. And white can try to counterattack with bishop to f4. But as you might imagine, we're just going to get in the way and block that with bishop d6. They take, we take in. Once again, white is busted. So we are hitting the queen. Queen has to move somewhere. If it moves away from the defense of the bishop, we'll just simply take that. Let's say the queen goes back to b3, but now we can remove the defender of this knight. Queen takes, and we can take with either piece. Probably taking with the bishop is a little bit better, and white is just up a piece. So in this position, the engine says, you guys will never guess it. The engine says this is, what do you know, minus 2.5 for black. Sliding back to this spot, if they try to protect the queen and the bishop with b3, then we're still going to hit them with that same fork, but now white can try very clever queen to e4, and obviously they've got some pressure here on the rook, and they're still adding support to the knight. But here, you could play a couple of different things. You could go ahead and take the bishop on a4, and then take the knight on the next move. That's perfectly winning. But even stronger is queen b7. Yikes. Why is that stronger? Well, they can't move the knight because that leaves the queen hanging. So whatever move they make, just make a move here. Now we take the bishop on a4, and whichever way they take back, if they take back with the pawn or they take back with the queen, let's just say they take with the queen, then just go ahead and make a move. Let's just say that we snap that off. Let's say they take with the queen, then we hit them with the bishop, and we're also hitting g2, and there is no counterplay over here because our bishop on f8's never moved. So this is super, super strong once this queen comes to b7. Engine says this is minus 2.9 for black. All right, so jumping back to this spot, those are all the lines if white gets greedy and tries to capture that pawn on c6 with the knight. Let's say they drop their bishop back to either d3 or b3. We'll look at d3 first. We're simply going to fianchetto the bishop, and I'm going to stop the line here. White can do a whole lot of different things, but black is meh. It's okay for black. White does have a small advantage, but black's plan here is to simply play bishop to d6, queen to c7, put some pressure on this guy, and castle short. So here the engine says this is plus 0.4 for white. Last thing we need to take a look at is what if they drop their bishop back to b3. Now this is a little bit more of a complicated, longer line, but I'd rather show it to you so you can see kind of the ideas here than you not see it at all. So here we are going to immediately go with queen to c7 to put some pressure on the knight. Let's say they defend that with d4. We're going to play our bishop d6. These are things we've already talked about before. Say both sides castle. From here, white has a couple of different things. They can add more support to the d4 pawn by pushing c3. And now we're going to play a5. Looks maybe kind of odd. I'll show you the point of that here in just a second. So let's say they play bishop f4, and now we have to break this pawn chain with, you guessed it, we cannot have a Caro-Kann lesson without our good buddy and pal c5 push. Now they cannot take this pawn on b5. Why? Well, if they do, tactics recognition, pieces lined up on the same straight line, we have bishop to a6, and that is the point of that a5 move, to get in on this diagonal. So white doesn't have anything better than simply trading here. We're going to take back. Let's say they bring their rook to the d file. We need to get off of the d line so that there are no tactics. I'll stop the line here. So 16 move line. I don't know if you'll ever see that or not, but just wanted to show you kind of the ideas. If they do pull this bishop back to b3, we want to put some pressure on this guy, and we've got to make a break with c5. This is completely equal. Now, I will say in this position, you do have to watch out for some knight sacrifices on f7. Again, tactics recognition. One of the things we think about are coordinated squares. That was condition number 6. So if they sacrifice here, they will have some coordination on this e6 square. But if they move the knight somewhere, black should be able to take on f4 and play queen to h5. And black should be okay there. Engine says this is dead equal. All right, so the last line that we're going to look at with these queen e2 moves very early on in the two knights attack is, what if they pin our knight with bishop to g5? No problem. We're simply going to play knight to d5, and now we're threatening f6. I'll go ahead and stop the line here, and black is perfectly fine here. Engine says this is minus 0.1 for black. Tiny advantage. And that takes us all the way back to the start of the two knights attack. So those were all of the lines where white puts their queen on e2. And let's say that instead they drop their knight back to g3. This is a very logical move. It is a book move. We've seen these kinds of positions before, so we're going to start pushing our pawns down their throats on the h file. So here they can defend with h3 or h4. If they play h4, we've seen this in some of the bishop f5 lines in the advanced variation in this mini-series, which was part 2 or part B. So we are going to stick our bishop on g4 and leave that there for about 3.5 years. And if they ever, put their bishop on e2 and move the knight, if they ever take, we're just going to take back. Black has very, very good control over g4, and conversely, white has good control over g5. So a lot of times in this type of position, white will develop bishop to e2, and we're going to play queen to c7. We've seen this in the exchange variation, which was the very first part of this mini-series. And anytime the Caro-Kann, we put the queen on c7, that means that we're trying to stop white from playing bishop to f4, which is what they want to do in a lot of these types of lines. I'll go ahead and stop the line here. It's pretty much dead equal. I personally play these lines all the time, basically on a daily basis. So a good strategy, what I usually like to try to do is play e6, play bishop to d6, put some pressure on this knight. If they don't do anything about that, at the lower levels, you'll get away with this. So e6, bishop d6, and you'll be able to take on g3. They take back, you take with the queen, that's a check, and that's going to be game over. Of course, I'm not fortunate enough to be able to get that. So what I see a lot of times is players will play this odd-looking knight back to f1. Or if these bishops are traded, sometimes white will bring their rook down to h3 and defend this knight horizontally. But in any case, it's perfectly fine. Black should have no problems here. Engine says this is minus 0.1. Okay, so instead of h4, if they push h3, then we're going to continue pushing. They have to drop their knight back to e2. And now from here, we're actually going to play a very odd, strange-looking move that we have not seen yet in this entire Caro-Kann series. And this is how nice I am. I'm going to give you guys 11 guesses, and you're only going to need 8.
Okay.
So what is the point of c5 for the 343rd time? We're just trying to get a lock on, a clamp down on the d4 square. That's all. So if they push this, then we'll take, and white will not have a pawn in the center, but black will. So this is perfectly fine for black, and the engine says this is dead even. And that, friends, is all for the two knights attack in the Caro-Kann defense. Okay, so next on the agenda is the very fearful Hillbilly Attack. Actually, the Hillbilly Attack is a horrible opening, and you should never play it in your chess career because black is already ahead after the second move of the game. e4, c6, and bishop c4. So we're going to continue with our normal Caro-Kann stuff, c6, d5, and we get to attack white with tempo on the second move. So there is a little trap here. If white does not take the pawn and drops their bishop back to b3, white is hoping that you take the e-pawn, they bring their queen down, and a lot of lines when white plays this early queen h5, black will have a knee-jerk reaction and just play knight to f6, hitting the queen and defending the e4 pawn. Of course, that would not work. You're falling right into the trap. And white takes f7, and black can go ahead and resign. So that doesn't work. But we are much smarter than that. So after queen to h5, we're simply going to block that nonsense with g6. We're attacking the queen. So this is like bad on all fronts because now the queen is going to have to move twice. The bishop has had to move twice while black is attacking and developing. So let's say that they bring their queen back to e2. Well, we're up a pawn. Let's defend it. Knight f6. And I'll stop here. That's it. There's nothing else to talk about. Black is just up a healthy pawn in the center of the board. If they play something like f3, we can just take that. d3, we can just take that and be up a pawn. There's really nothing going on here. I'll stop the line. Engine says this is As you might guess, 0.9 minus 0.9 for black. Okay, I'm going to leave that evaluation on the screen. So going back to this spot, so the only two moves that white has here that doesn't immediately lose is dropping the queen back to e2 or back to h4. If they play queen back to h4, there are a couple things you could do. You could just give up the pawn and play a5, but I prefer to hold on to it and just play bishop f5. And if white tries to kick that bishop away with g4, then you just bring this guy all the way back to c8. And this pawn breaks up the communication with the queen and the pawn. And the next move, we're going to play knight f6. And we're going to hold on to this. If they play the best move, which is actually to push f3, we can have an exchange here. And then we're going to play e6. And now this bishop is locked in. And, oh, by the way, we're offering a trade of queens. If they take that, no problem at all. We'll just take with the king. No problem that we can't castle. And it's very difficult to attack this bishop, and black is just up a pawn. So I left the valuation up on the screen. This is also minus 0.9 for black. So those were a few of the lines in the main trap variation of the Hillbilly Attack that simply don't work. Let's say white plays a little bit more commonly or logically, and they take on d5, we take back, and this is already bad for white because they're having to move their piece twice. So let's say they drop the bishop down and give us a check on b5. We're going to block that with the bishop. Let's say that they take that. Now, the computer slightly favors taking with the knight. I actually prefer taking with the queen, and here's why. A very logical move that white can play is just develop normally with knight to f3. We slide our queen in, give this check, and unless white wants a terrible position, they really need to offer the trade of queens. We're happily snap that off. We're going to play f6, and black is going for this huge center. And if white doesn't do anything about it, if they just play a random move, something like this, then we play e5, and we have basically one of the best pawn structures in all of chess. Black has two pawns here in the center, and white only has one pawn in the center, so black would be much better. So white really needs to play d4 here to prevent this, and now we're simply going to play e6, and this is also one of the best pawn structures when you have this kind of two step up, because we are literally boxing out all of these squares. So white doesn't have as much space, and we will likely continue bishop to d6, maybe get this knight to f5, pressuring d4, castling short, and black is completely fine here. And the engine says this is minus 0.2 for black. Going back to this spot, let's say white does play d4. We're simply going to develop knight to c6, put pressure on the pawn. White's best move is to play the strange-looking knight to e2 to help support the d4 pawn. And the next several moves are just normal developing type moves that we would play, put the bishop on d6. If they do come down and put pressure on the knight, then we would gladly welcome that exchange. We're actually not going to do anything about it. We're going to play queen to c7, immediately put pressure on h2, assuming that white does something about that, maybe moves one of their pawns here. If white exchanges on f6, I would actually strongly consider moving my king to e7 and not even castling on either side, because if you castle long, you're walking right into a ready-made pawn storm. And unlike the Bronstein-Larsen that we talked about in part C, white does not have the light squared bishop. So once they exchange here, we would kind of do the same thing as the Bronstein-Larsen and try to double rooks on the g-file, maybe push our h-pawn down the board. We have some good sacrifice tactical ideas to attack white's king. So here, black is fine. The engine says this is minus 0.3 for black. So let's look at what happens when white drops their bishop back to b3, which is what you will see at least 9 out of 10 games, most likely. So if you don't remember anything else I say about the Hillbilly Attack, you got to remember to get that bishop out to f5 when they retreat back to b3. That is the best square for the bishop. From here, you're likely just to see some normal developing type moves. If they do bring their bishop down and pin this knight here, you might think, let's get out of the pin with bishop e7, but here we're going to push h6 and ask the question, what do you want to do? Do you want to go back or do you want to take? If they do take, technically taking with the queen is slightly better, but also almost just as good as I would recommend that you continue exploring, testing the waters with taking with the g-pawn in that Bronstein-Larsen type fashion. Take back here, bishop to d6, queen c7, get your rooks lined up on the g-file. It's going to be very, very fun. If white drops the bishop back to h4, we do have a very interesting pawn sacrifice coming up here. We're going to lash out with g5, kick the bishop, and we're going to sacrifice the g5 pawn. We push h5. That allows white to take on g5, and if they do, we're going to push h4, kick that bishop, and now you see the point of the pawn sacrifice, rook g8. And so we are lining up all of our pieces on the g file here. I'll go ahead and stop the line, but again, we're going to be looking at bishop to d6, queen c7, maybe doubling here on the g file, and at some point when the time is right, we will consider pushing h3. And black is doing actually very, very well here. This bishop is just so far off sides. It cannot come back over here to help anytime soon. So black's going to enjoy this position. Nice attacking lines. The engine says this is minus 1.2 for black, almost winning. And notice that white really doesn't have anything developed, and black's got a lot of pieces over here that will eventually be pointing towards the king side. Moving back to this spot, obviously white does not have to take the pawn sacrifice on g5. Instead, let's say they jump their knight into e5. So here, for grins and giggles, I'm just going to show you a fairly lengthy example line just to show you how good this can be for black. We're going to jump our knight into e4, put some pressure on that bishop. Let's say that they exchange on c6 and they put their bishop on e5. We're going to kick that guy out, or so we think. They can counterattack our knight. We're going to snap off their bishop. They take our knight. We take that e4 pawn. They take e5. We develop with tempo, develop with check. King goes in the corner. We're going to snap that queen off. And this is something that I harp on and emphasize all the time with my students. When you get to the end game, close to the end game, pay attention to the color of your opponent's bishop if they only have one. White has the light squared bishop, so we want most of our heavy hitters, queens, rooks, and kings on dark squares. So here we simply play king up, king to e7 on that dark square, and white is busted. Black is going to easily contest the d file here with the two rooks. White hasn't really developed yet. Black has these two beautiful bishops, right? These guys are amazing. White has this really, really weak e-pawn, and black is actually crushing it here. The material is completely even, but the engine says this is, wow, minus 3.2 for black. Okay, let me show you this real quick in case you see it. I run into this fairly often against the Hillbilly. So instead of castling, white might play this early a3 move, and that does a couple of things. Number one, if they get their knight to c3, that stops us from pinning it with bishop to b4, but also this bishop is a target. If you don't play this move, this bishop can be a target. So a lot of times I like to come over here with knight a5 and just snap this guy off, or obviously pushing the a pawn down the board. So that's why they might play that. So here we can develop, and then if they get the knight out, we're going to do the same thing. We'll play h6. So we are stopping them from pinning our knight, and they are stopping us from pinning their knight. I'll go ahead and stop the line here. This is very, very good for black. Engine says this is minus 0.8 for black. Okay, so let's go back to the start of the Hillbilly when they drop their bishop back to b3. So from here, they have several things they can do. We just took a look at some knight f3 lines. I will say just very quickly, if they do give us a check here on a4, then of course we're going to block with the knight. This is just not that great because they have now moved their bishop 1, 2, 3 times. So engine says this is like minus 0.3. So let's take a quick look at an example d4 line. So here we're going to play our normal knight c6. Let's say they play knight c3. We're going to get in e6. And as soon as that knight comes to f3, what do? Yep, I haven't shown that guy in a while. So pin that sucker, right? And so this is even worse in the Hillbilly because, again, this bishop is really not in a great spot. It cannot come over here to help with this pin. And if white ever plays h3, as we do a lot of times, we're going to snap that knight off on f3, and that's removing a defender of the d4 pawn. And since there's a knight on c3, they can't play c3 to defend this. So if we remove that defender, then we have our normal get the knight to f5 to put pressure here, queen to b6 to put pressure here, and this is actually fantastic for black. So in this position, the engine says this is minus 0.6 for black. All right, so the last line that we will look at in the Hillbilly attack is if they play d3. Well, that's a bit of a passive move. We're going to play our normal knight to c6. Let's say they get their bishop out to f4, and they really couldn't do anything about it anyway, but we're going to hit them with e5, and black is going to have a huge center in this line. So here we're going to play bishop to c5. They get the knight out, and what do? You'll never guess it. Yes, sir. We're going to pin the knight, and this is a really, really tough position for white. If they kick it with h3, and this is one of the reasons why I'm showing this example line, go ahead and pause the video. What would you play here? Yeah, so kind of one of our rules when we're thinking about whether or not we should trade or drop it back. One thing is whether or not they have control over e5, which they do have a couple of pieces here, but the other reason why we want to take is because we want to remove the defender of d4. Well, the pawn on d4 is invisible. It does not exist. So there's no reason to take the knight. So in this case, we're going to drop it back. Now, it looks on the surface like that loses the e5 pawn, but it is safe because of the pin on the queen. So if white were to take that with the bishop, then we would take, and the knight cannot take back. Okay, so from here, let's say white develops. We're going to develop knight to, we're going to develop knight to e7. And I'll go ahead and stop the line. This just kind of overprotects the d5 pawn, and black just has an absolute massive center. And this is very, very nice for black. Engine says this is minus 0.9, almost a full pawn for black. And that will do it for the Hillbilly Attack. All right, so very briefly, I'm only going to show you one line in the King's Indian Attack. And what I'm going to show you technically is not the Caro-Kann, because white is going to start with d4, but as I said way back in the very beginning of the Caro-Kann introduction, if white plays d4, we can play c6, and if they put the second pawn on e4, well, then we transpose to the Caro-Kann. So it doesn't matter which pawn they push first if they put both in the center. However, in this line, we are going to play c6, but they're not going to play e4. They're going to play knight f3. Well, we can continue with our first two normal Caro-Kann moves. And now if you see this move, and it doesn't have to be on the third move. This could be the first move, the second move, or whatever. Whenever you see white play this g3 move, they're going to fianchetto their bishop. And when the time is right, they're going to push e4. So this is called the King's Indian Attack from the white side. So I want to show you what to do. And all you got to remember is get that bishop to g4. If that's the only thing you remember about this King's Indian setup, bishop to g4 is the move. So we have some normal developing moves, something like this. And now when they kick our bishop, what do? Well, again, you can pause the video, see if you can figure it out on your own. Okay, we're not going to take the knight. Usually we do like to take it to remove the defender. Now this time there is a pawn on d4, but what is the difference here? If you take the knight, they can take back with a bishop, and it's going to be very difficult for black to put pressure on the d pawn because they have two different pawns that can support it, right? They're going to have lots of pieces that potentially could support this. So taking the knight here actually is the wrong move. We're going to drop it back. If they ever push g4, we just drop our bishop back to g6. I'll go ahead and stop the line here. And this is a pretty even position, nothing really going on. But I just wanted you to remember, get that get that bishop to g4 in this King's Indian Attack. Engine says this is minus 0.1, basically equal. All right, so we will finish up this masterclass mini-series on the Caro-Kann Defense with sort of a compilation of a lot of different beginner, amateur type moves and move sequences, different move orders. And remember, no matter how good you are, every chess player was an amateur at one point, but we do need to have some basic ideas and concepts in our chess toolbox when white plays some offbeat, kind of off the wall type of stuff. So let's start here with e4, c6, and a lot of different things, obviously, that white can do. Let's say that they play knight f3. We've seen this before. We played d5, but we haven't seen white capture the pawn or push it forward. First thing we'll look at is what if they push this forward? Well, then we get to introduce this guy. Yep, pin and win. And now if white plays d4, because they have played this strange move order, then black is now in a position they want to be in, but they're up a tempo. This is very similar to the advanced variation where white had already played d4 and we played bishop to f5, and at some point we pinned the knight. So I'll open up another board here and refresh your memory on that. So we have e4, c6, d4, d5, advanced variation. And I recommend c5, but in the speed run, I will also play bishop to f5, and I've played that very often in my chess career. And now if they play c3, we play e6, they develop the knight. At some point, we will pin this knight, but you'll notice that we move the bishop twice, once and then twice. Well, here in this kind of weird move order, we got to go straight to pinning the knight without having to make a pit stop at f5. So black is already very good here. And so we'll continue with e6. I'll stop the line here, and black is already neutralized. And white is penalized because they played a kind of a weird sequence there. Engine says this is minus 0.1. All right, so going back to this spot, we just took a look at what happens if white plays d4. What if they play knight c3? So this is something very important to keep in mind, guys, in the Caro-Kann, and I have this in the notes over there to the side. If white never pushes d4 or they delay it for too long, then black needs to consider pushing d4 themselves. And this is a very good example. We're going to push d4, and now white's never going to get this move in, and white's going to end up being passive. Now the knight has to move. Let's say it goes to e4. Well, we're going to play e6. Let's say they offer a trade of pawns. We're not going to take that. Nope, we are going to play queen to d5, attacking the knight. We're just going to start attacking stuff. Now they have to defend the knight. Maybe they push d3. We're going to snap off that knight. They recapture with the queen. We're going to develop knight to d7. And here there's only one move that white has that doesn't basically immediately lose. And they have to throw in this check on d6. It doesn't really help that much. We're going to snap that off. Now, if white takes that, then we'll take their queen and damage their pawn structure. So they need to insert the intermezzo. Queen takes d5. We take back with the c pawn. Now they have to take our bishop. And here, I think a lot of you guys would probably take this pawn. This would be a positional mistake because our b7 pawn is a little bit weak. If you take that, all you're doing is you're allowing white to have an open b file to play with. And we don't want to end up having to play something passive like rook b8 or something like this. So we're just going to ignore that. We're just going to develop. And if white takes this, the very next voice that they will hear in their head will be, yeah, triple pawns on the D file, right? And how often have you seen triple pawns on a file that are not back to back to back? There's a space in between. The space between the triple pawn is a crazy position. And the engine is agreeing that this is horrible. And the engine says that this is minus 1.2 for black. Yeah, good luck white trying to survive this position. Yep, and back to this spot. So we just took a look at some lines where they push this. Let's say that they take on d5 and we take back. Now, this is very similar to the exchange variation, but what I'm going to show you, they never play d4. Because if they did play d4, we would transpose right back into the exchange variation. So a couple of different things that they can do from here. Let's say that they play knight to c3. Just like in the exchange variation, our next move is going to be knight to c6 unless they play the Panov in the exchange variation. But they don't even have d4 played yet. Okay, so we're going to play knight to c6. Let's say from here they pin the knight. And what do you think we play from here? You guessed it, pin and win. This is not an issue. We can just take back. If they play h3 here, we actually would exchange on f3, and black is perfectly fine, and black has already neutralized. Engine says this is minus 0.1. Okay, going back to this spot, we just took a look at knight c3. What if they play this weird-looking b3? And that's something I definitely never see. You might see it at the lower levels. What do? Not much, just normal development. Knight c6. Let's say they fianchetto their bishop. Now, you could get the bishop out to f5. That's perfectly playable. Of course, we can always pin the knight with bishop g4. I'm not quite as excited to pin this because of two things. Number one, they can easily play bishop to e2 to get out of the pin, but also we like to pin the knight because we sometimes want to remove the defender on f3 of the d4 square. Well, there's no pawn on d4. So if they play h3, I'm not going to be thinking about taking that to remove a defender of a pawn that doesn't exist. So I would definitely bring the bishop back there. What if they come down and pin our knight? Pretty kind of like a symmetrical type position. We just play e6 and there's not much going on here. Black has already equalized and the engine says this is minus 0.2 for black. All right, back to this spot. We've seen knight c3. We've seen b3. What if they give us the immediate check? We've seen positions like this before. We're going to block with the bishop. Let's say this time they don't take. They play something weird like queen to e2. Well, they're hoping that we will take their bishop and they'll come down and retake it with their queen, give us a check. They're hoping for something like this. And we block with a knight. They're hoping maybe we blunder our b7 pawn, but of course we are too smart for that. So after queen to e2, we're just going to play e6. And there's nothing here in this position. Black is already neutralized. And the engine says this is minus 0.2 for black again. Hopping back to this spot, the fourth line we can check in this variation is what if they play bishop to e2. Your knee-jerk reaction might be bishop to g4, but we're not pinning that knight anymore. So anytime white's light squared bishop is on e2, this is not near as attractive. You can play it, it's perfectly fine. Let's put the bishop on f5. Let's say they castle, we play some normal stuff, and then they play knight to c3. So let's let's test you guys out. What would you play here? Pause the video, see if you can remember. All right, pat on the back if you said push. D4 is correct. Again, we've seen this now for the second or third time. If white is stubborn and they're not ever going to push D4, we need to push D4 to gain some space in the center. And believe it or not, the best move for white is to say, okay, I'm sorry, I was wrong. Let me go back, take two, try again. White's in a bit of a bind here, right? And now we can push E5 and develop, and we're just going to have a massive center here. So white is in trouble and black is happy. Engine says this is minus 0.4 for black. Okay, returning back to the start, those were some lines with knight f3. What if they hit us with this early f4? I'm sure some of you guys have seen this before many times. Well, we're going to still continue with d5. White has a couple of options. Now, if they push this, we are going to play bishop to f5, and this is going to transpose to the exact same line that we already saw back in part B of this mini series with the advanced variation. It's just now it's a different move order. So they're going to play d4 and we play e6. So it won't hurt to see this again for a second time. In part B, they played this move last as opposed to playing it on the second move. So just to refresh your memory, what do we do here? We're going to want to play break with c5 as always. We want to play knight to e7. If they ever come down and attack this bishop, say something like this and this, then we want to have the knight here to recapture on f5. I would strongly consider playing h5 at some point to prevent them from playing g4. So we solidify our claim here on the f5 square. And this is completely fine for black. And the engine says minus 0.2 for black. We've seen that evaluation a lot. Backing up to this spot, instead of pushing, if white captures on d5, we take back as normal. And I'm actually going to stop the line here. I mean, this is already bad for white. The whole point of pushing f4 in these lines, and really in general, is to help support a pawn on e5. And if you don't push that pawn to e5, if you take and there's no e pawn here, then this pawn actually looks kind of silly. Like, what is it doing out here in no man's land on f4? And from here, we're just going to play our normal stuff, knight c6, probably bishop f5, e6, normal development. But black is already doing very, very well here because of this strange kind of move sequence here. Engine says this is minus 0.5. White is punished by being half a pawn down by not understanding why the f4 move is played in these kinds of lines. So we have now seen knight to f3. We've seen f4. Let's take a look at knight c3. We are going to continue, and if white takes that, we take back. Now here, if they play d4, then we will exactly transpose to the exchange variation where we will play knight c6 like we always do. But let's say instead they come down and give us this early check, bishop b5. We're going to block that with knight to c6. Let's say they develop knight f3, and as always, we are going to pin that, and I'll go ahead and stop the line here. Again, we have a similar kind of a symmetrical type position. We saw something like this a few moments ago, but the bishop was fianchettoed on b2. Here, there's a knight on c3. And so it's basically the same thing. And if you've made it this far in the video, if you're looking at these lines and wondering, man, all of these look very, very similar, that's right. I'm kind of doing this on purpose for two reasons. Number one, the more times you see the same moves and motifs, the more likely it will be to stick with you. But also, secondly, just to emphasize the point that when white does weird move orders and plays kind of weird stuff, most of the time that doesn't really change what we do. And this is no different. Engine says this is minus 0.1, again, neutralized. And backsliding here, so that's what happens if white takes the pawn on d5. What if they immediately push? Well, I'll give you guys another opportunity, another shot at it. Go ahead and pause the video. What would you play here as black? Another pat on the back if you said push d4. That is correct. And now this has got to be at least the third or fourth time when white doesn't play d4 that we push d4 ourselves. And in this position, white can actually go to a couple of different squares here. We'll take a look at knight to e4. And we've also seen this position. What would you play here? Same thing as last time when we pushed d4. We hit them with queen d5, and now we're attacking with tempo. They got to do something about this. This is hanging, and already, once again, white is in trouble here. I'll stop the line here. Engine says this is minus 0.4 for black. So if white instead drops their knight back to e2, yeah, this is not how you play chess. So what would you play here? You'll never, okay. Yeah, I got to stop saying that. You absolutely will guess it. Guys, we're on move 4, and white has already screwed up because they have chosen to play some subpar, inaccurate moves, and now black has a very nice center. This pawn is weak. And I will say that this is about the only time, one of the main times where when white plays offbeat stuff, we do something different outside of our normal development when we push this d4 pawn to gain some space in the center. Otherwise, we're just playing mostly normal developing moves. Engine says this is minus 0.2 for black. And regressing all the way back to this spot. So we have taken a look at knight f3, f4, knight c3. Let's check out what happens if white plays this early h3 move. Well, obviously they are doing that because they don't want our bishop to come to g4. So it makes some sense, but this is not really something that kind of violates one of our opening principles, which is you don't need to be playing these early pawn preventative moves at the expense of developing your minor pieces and pawns toward the center. So here we are going to continue with d5. Let's say they take that. We take back, and this is basically like an exchange variation without the d4 being played yet. So what do? We would play it like an exchange. We always play knight c6. Now they play d4. We can't pin the knight because of h3, so we go bishop f5. And I'll go ahead and stop the line here. And white has given up all of their advantage from being able to go first because they used one of their moves on this pawn preventative move instead of playing, bishop d3 or normal developing type stuff. So from here, we're going to look at our normal e6, normal development. I will say one thing to note here, if they do go with this kind of delayed Panov attack with c4, we actually are going to take that. We don't want to allow them to push and then push here, and then maybe they get some stuff going here on the queen side. So on c4, we are going to take that, which is not something we would do in the normal Panov. All right, so we're fine here. Engine says this is dead equal. All right, home stretch, guys. We've seen a3, knight f3, knight c3, f4. A couple more things to check out with the d pawn push. Let's check out d3 first. We will continue with d5. I've seen some crazy things here from my students' games, like an early queen h5. That kind of stuff has to be punished immediately. Just attack it. Queen goes here. Takes. White is already lost. That kind of stuff. But here there is actually a strange line. So after we go d5, they play knight f3, and that looks very odd because we can take, and we take the queen, and white can't castle. And believe it or not, guys, this actually is a book move. This actually is a thing. I don't know why you would ever want to go in for this where white can't castle. And from here, black can do all kinds of different setups. I'm not very excited to pin the knight on f3 because, again, there's no pawn on d4 and they can easily get out of the pin. I'm going to recommend a fianchetto setup, playing g6. And let's say the best move for white here is to play knight b to d2. And here we're going to develop knight to f6, putting some pressure on this pawn. If they ever push this, this is very similar to an early e5 push in the King's Indian attack, and it's just no good when the queens are off the board, because now when I'm playing the King's Indian attack, or excuse me, the King's Indian defense with my students, I make sure they understand the correct move here is knight to g4. And now white's in trouble because you're threatening the fork on f2 and you're also attacking the e5 pawn. And if white responds to that with something like king e1, and now we're glad we gave our bishop a fianchetto square on g7. And what are you doing about this pawn here? So this is very, very good for black. And Engine says this is minus 0.7. All right, guys, we're going to wrap up by taking a look at several lines where white pushes d4 and then does some off-the-wall stuff. d4, d5, let's say they push. This is the advanced variation we've seen before. Black can play bishop f5 or push c5. Let's say you go with the c5 push. They play c3, we play knight c6. All of this is complete theory book. But now let's say that they take. We have not seen this yet, a little bit different move order. Well, they're leaving the e5 pawn hanging. So we take that. And now let's say that they try to hold on to this pawn by playing something like b4. Again, this would be kind of like a amateur type move. And these pawns, this pawn structure is absolutely terrible. I'll go ahead and stop the line here. Normally, we start our undermining process and start trying to chip away. We're not quite ready for that here, because if we end up pushing b6 and they take, we can't take with the queen because our d pawn is hanging, because there's nothing here on d4. So here we're just going to do a fianchetto setup. We're going to play g6, bishop g7, knight f6. We're going to castle, and then we'll work on trying to tear down this pawn structure. If they ever give a check with the light squared bishop on b5, we just simply block that with the bishop, and it's no problem at all. And black is up a nice little advantage here. Engine says this is minus 0.3 for black. Returning to this spot, so that's what happens when they take on c5 and play something weird. Let's say that they immediately get the bishop out to e3. We have not seen this yet either. And this is one of the rare times in this whole sideline video where we are actually going to play something weird ourselves, or something not natural. They're going to play something weird. We're going to play something weird. Knight h6. What in the world is this move about? Well, white has already moved their dark bishop once, so they're not really advised to move it again. I mean, they can take that and double our pawns, but they're leaving us with the bishop pair, and they basically wasted a tempo by doing that. So they're not, this would give black a pretty nice advantage. So it's not likely that they're going to take that. Let's say they develop knight to f3, and now the point of knight h6 reveals itself. We go knight f5, and we cannot go to f5 via this route because we haven't moved the e pawn yet. So that's why we need to go to knight h6 first so we can get to f5. And now we've got some pressure on this bishop. We've got lots of pressure on d4. And black is perfectly fine here and has already neutralized. Engine says this is minus 0.1. All right. Going back to this spot. So we looked at some lines where they push. What if they capture and then play some offbeat stuff? This is the exchange variation. We always play knight c6 on the next move unless they play the Panov. And here white plays bishop to d3. I'll give you guys a chance to pause the video. What would you play here as black? Pause now. Yeah, whoops. They just left the pawn hanging on d4. And a lot of Caro lines at the beginner level, white will simply hang that pawn there. Now, I will tell you, you got to be very careful, because sometimes when you take a free pawn there, white, and especially when the bishop is on d3, so make a mental note of this, white will sometimes have a check there with a discovered attack on whatever is on d4. And sometimes the queen is actually capturing a pawn. They have this little cheeky check, and black ends up losing the queen. But in this case, the check doesn't work because we can simply capture back with the knight. And now if they take our knight, this is absolutely lost for white. Black is doing very, very well. Their king is kind of open. They have no pawns in the center of the board. We have 2 pawns in the center, and Black is crushing it. And the engine says in this position, it is minus 2.2 for Black. And with that, boys and girls, ladies and gentlemen, I will shut down this masterclass mini-series on the Caro-Kann Defense. You have done it. If you made it this far, congratulations. You should definitely feel like this.
I'm the king of the world!
So, all 5 parts is more than 5 hours of information, probably a little bit more than I anticipated. But my goal as a teacher and educator is to show you guys everything. And I know it's an impossible amount of information to absorb, unless you're an international grandmaster and dedicating your life to all this. There's no way a normal human being can remember all this, but that's not the point. We're not here to memorize exact lines. We're here to understand the concepts and the main ideas and see the same things over and over so we know what to do. So the main takeaways from the Caro-Kann Defense, I think, are, when in doubt, pinning the bishop, pinning the knight on f3 with bishop g4, pushing that c5 pawn that we saw a million times, and our normal kind of setups are hopefully the things that stick with you the most. I certainly hope you guys got something out of this. So the next item on the agenda will be for me to conduct a speed run with the Caro-Kann Defense, where I'll start at a rating of around 600 and take it all the way up to 2,000 in increments of 100. So stay tuned for that. And I appreciate it, guys. Thanks so much. Hope you enjoyed this masterclass. Take care.